To create a batik, the first thing I do is that I take the design and I outline in wax using the copper instrument that's called a chanting. Then I brush in the outlined area with melted beeswax and paraffin. There's no way to erase a drop of unwanted dye or wax, so I have to take great care while I'm working. I use state-of-the-art fiber reactive Procyon dyes that react chemically with the silk to become part of the cloth. The dyes come in powder form and are mixed with exact proportions of water, urea, calgon, baking soda, and washing soda. Any mistake in the chemistry will cause the dyes to bleed, which will ruin the batik. Testing on paper towels and scraps of fabric, I'll spend several hours working out a satisfactory color harmony, often comparing my dyes to the colors in nature. When I apply the liquid dyes to the fabric, I use a brush or a sponge. The waxed areas resist the dye applied to the fabric. Often, I'll apply 2 or more colors adjacent to each other and blend them with a sponge wedge to create a very subtle color transition. Batik is a Javanese word for dyeing textiles. The oldest known batiks have been traced back to Japan's Nara period, 718 to 794 AD. But you can find them in many countries, well before the Middle Ages. Not only Japan, but China, India, Africa, Greece. It is an Eastern art form that is not practiced as readily in the West because it's time-consuming and meditative, and our culture does things in a much faster way. The first time that I ever tried batik, I was in college, and the very first time that I saw dyes on white silk turning it into a color, I fell in love with the medium. My very first piece was not very good. Neither were my other pieces that followed for a few years, but just the joy of the medium, from thinking of a design, or in my case, taking an aerial photograph that I know will become a batik, to finding that design, to putting the drawing on, to waxing the first time, to dyeing. Each wax and dye is actually a tiny little abstract painting, and the layers form over each other to become just something really juicy with all those layers of design. Whenever you put dye onto cloth, it's actually darker than the dye is going to dry to. So you learn to think of your dry colors even when they're wet. Your mind just gets used to that. Then once they're dry and you put wax on the piece, the wax darkens the color because it's penetrating and resisting the next dye. So it's like a negative of a picture. And eventually you'll be able to, in your own mind, remember those colors before and know that what's dark is really light and what's light is really dark.
That's cool.
I learned from Fred Andrade, who's a master batiker, to put them on the sawhorses, which lets me walk around the design. Plus, it's flipped over upside down, and you're looking at it upside down and backwards. And I think every time you can look at art from a different perspective, you get a little bit of a more refined art design. Most people use the crackle in batik. I don't, because I like an extremely clean design. So I put mine flat on the sawhorses so that I can be very specific every dye lot. And I have a lot of control that way. You flip a batik over because the wax does not always penetrate to the other side. So when you flip it over, you actually lose all the lines of your original design, and you just work on it from a totally aesthetic point of view. And you fill in any gaps and just make it beautiful. It has to read enough, since I work with scientists often, to be scientific, but it's purely a piece of art for me. I do aerial imagery because I love to fly. I come from a flying family. When I was 2 weeks old, I went up in my granddaddy's plane with my daddy. And when I'd come home, a lot of times Daddy'd say, "You want to go flying?" I'd go, "Yeah." So we'd fly around, and I always thought it was so interesting because the houses got so small and the cars got so small, and just all your troubles just go away whenever you go flying, and the world looks so eloquent and beautiful and workable, and you just have this spiritual kind of lush feeling. But for me, the aerial viewpoint has become an environmental part of my work, and I'm finding myself more and more, you can show in one aerial photograph or a series of film images or one batik the beauty of the environment or a specific element that you want to point out. You can even take 20 disparate ideas and put them into one piece of art. When my boss, Orrin Pilkey, started working with me, he insisted that I start to shoot the marks that humanity has made on our environment, such as jetties. You can see from the air every scar on the earth. You can see where land has been cleared. You can see where the tops of mountains have been carved out. You can see where houses have been just scrunched together like a lot of little tiny boxes. And you can see also the areas that are undeveloped in their purest state, where they're allowed to move as they need to, particularly on barrier islands, where they rise and swell with the water, and in sea level rise times, that's so important. My most recent flight was with South Wings, and we flew up the Great Peedee River and took pictures, and when we got to the site of the coal plant, the land was already cleared, and they were ready to put that coal plant. The coal plant's even on maps, on road maps, which just astounds me. After we finished that flight, I rented another plane with an instructor so that I could take off and land and set up my own shots. And we flew all the way from Georgetown up to North Carolina to the mouth of the Cape Fear River, which is the river that I grew up on in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And that was a long, long flight and very, very interesting. I really had not before shot the buildings. And it was very interesting as an aerial photographer for, I guess, 30 years now, to change my attitude and decide that I had to photograph now man-made structures. Heat is used to remove the wax and set the dyes for the final stage. The batik is sandwiched between 2 layers of white paper and placed on a pad of newspaper. The paper is ironed to melt the wax, which soaks into the paper. When no more wax is absorbed by the paper, I'll iron the batik once more to further heat set the dyes. The batik is then dry cleaned to remove any wax and washed in a chemical detergent to remove excess dye and pencil lines. Whenever I'm ironing, I really like to have good music, and I consider it my form of exercise.